You set a goal. You felt genuinely excited about it. Maybe it was a new routine, a project you wanted to finish, or a habit you committed to building. For the first few days, everything worked. You followed through. You felt in control. And then, without any clear warning, the energy disappeared. Not because something went wrong. Not because life got harder. The excitement simply stopped showing up. And the behavior you thought you had locked in started slipping away, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you realized you had completely stopped. Most people explain this experience the same way. They say they lost motivation. They blame themselves for lacking willpower or discipline. They assume there is something fundamentally broken about the way they function. But that explanation is not only incomplete, it is psychologically inaccurate. Motivation was never designed to be a permanent state. It was designed to be a signal. And when you understand what kind of signal it is, and why the brain produces it in the first place, the entire pattern of behavior suddenly makes sense in a way it never did before. Motivation is generated by a specific circuit inside the brain. That circuit is driven largely by dopamine, a neurotransmitter most people associate with pleasure. But dopamine is not actually a pleasure chemical. That is one of the most common misunderstandings in popular psychology. Dopamine is an anticipation chemical. It is released when the brain predicts a reward, not when it receives one. When you set a new goal, your brain creates a mental image of the future outcome. It imagines the version of you that has finished the project, built the habit, or achieved the result. That image generates a dopamine spike. That spike is what you experience as motivation. It feels like energy, like drive, like momentum. But it is actually just a neural prediction, and predictions have a very specific expiration date. This is where the mechanism becomes important to understand. The brain does not sustain dopamine release around something that becomes familiar. Once a goal or routine stops feeling new, once the reward prediction becomes predictable rather than exciting, dopamine drops. The brain no longer needs to generate that anticipation signal because it already knows what to expect. From a biological standpoint, the novelty has been processed. The mental simulation of the future reward is no longer powerful enough to override the discomfort of present effort. What felt like a surge of motivation at the beginning was actually the brain responding to something new. The moment the new becomes routine, the fuel changes. And if you were running on novelty-driven dopamine alone, you will feel the drop almost immediately. This is not a character flaw. This is neuroscience. And it explains something that most productivity advice completely ignores. The standard advice tells you to stay motivated, to remember your why, to visualize your goals. All of that sounds reasonable, but it misunderstands the biological structure of motivation. Visualization and remembering your why only generate another small dopamine signal. It gives you a temporary lift, not a sustainable engine. If your behavior depends on feeling motivated, then your behavior is always going to be vulnerable to the moment motivation fades, which, neurologically speaking, is guaranteed to happen. There is also a second mechanism working against sustained behavior, and it operates in parallel with the dopamine drop. It is called the effort-reward imbalance. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term planning and rational decision-making, understands the value of a distant goal. It knows that consistent effort over time will produce a meaningful result. But the brain's older, faster systems, the ones that manage discomfort avoidance and short-term survival, operate on a much shorter timeline. These systems are constantly scanning the environment for signals of threat and comfort. When they register that a task is effortful, uncertain, or mentally demanding, they generate a quiet but persistent pull away from that task. That pull does not feel like a rational decision. It feels like restlessness, distraction, or the sudden urge to check your phone. It feels like resistance for no reason. But there is a reason. The brain's comfort-seeking systems are working exactly as they were designed to work. The modern environment makes this problem significantly worse. The average person in a digital lifestyle is exposed to an almost continuous stream of high-stimulation inputs. Social media feeds, notifications, short-form video content, and instant entertainment are all engineered to deliver rapid dopamine spikes with almost zero effort required. When the brain is regularly exposed to that level of stimulation, its baseline dopamine sensitivity shifts. Tasks that would have felt rewarding in a lower stimulation environment now feel flat and unappealing by comparison. Your brain is not broken. It is simply recalibrated around the level of stimulation it most frequently receives. Deep work, slow progress, and consistent effort cannot compete with that recalibration. And this is why mental fatigue and overstimulation are not just productivity problems. They are neurological ones. There is a concept in behavioral neuroscience called hedonic adaptation, and it operates quietly in the background of almost every goal you set. Hedonic adaptation describes the brain's tendency to return to a neutral emotional baseline after any positive change. When you start something new and exciting, your emotional response to that activity is high. Over time, the brain adapts. The same activity produces less emotional response. The excitement normalizes. This is not failure. This is a deeply efficient neurological process that prevents the brain from being permanently overwhelmed by any single source of stimulation. But it also means that motivation built on emotional excitement has a built-in expiration timeline. The brain adapts, and the feeling fades, regardless of how meaningful the goal actually is. Understanding this should reframe the question entirely. The question is no longer how do you stay motivated? The question becomes what actually sustains behavior when motivation is not present. And the answer, supported by decades of behavioral research, has very little to do with inspiration, excitement, or emotional drive. It has everything to do with environmental design, identity structure, and habit architecture. The brain is fundamentally a pattern recognition and energy conservation machine. It does not like spending energy on decisions that do not need to be made. When a behavior is repeated consistently in the same context, the brain begins to automate that behavior. It shifts the activity from the prefrontal cortex, where conscious decision-making happens, to the basal ganglia, where automatic routines are stored. Once that shift happens, the behavior no longer requires motivation to execute. It requires a trigger, a specific time, location, or preceding action that signals the brain to run the stored routine. This is the actual structure of a habit, and it is why habits feel effortless once formed while still feeling like work during the formation period. The energy investment is front-loaded. The automation comes later. But here is what most people miss about habit formation. Context is not just helpful. It is neurologically necessary. The brain does not store habits as abstract instructions. It stores them as context-dependent patterns. The environment is not just where behavior happens. It is part of the trigger structure itself. This is why it is significantly harder to maintain a habit when your environment changes, and why new environments can sometimes make it easier to start a new behavior. If your current environment is saturated with cues that reinforce low-effort, high-stimulation behavior, then you are working against yourself every time you try to sustain something more demanding. Redesigning the environment is not a motivational trick. It is a neurological intervention. Identity plays a deeper role than most people realize, and it operates at a level below conscious motivation. The brain is constantly running a background process that asks a deceptively simple question: who am I? And the answer to that question shapes behavior more powerfully than goals, plans, or motivation ever will. When a behavior is consistent with your self-concept, the brain experiences almost no friction around it. When a behavior conflicts with your self-concept, the brain generates resistance even when you consciously want to engage in that behavior. This is why a person who identifies as a reader picks up books without thinking about it, while someone who identifies as someone who should read more feels friction every time they try. The behavior is the same. The identity relationship is different. And the brain responds to the identity, not the intention. This is also why superficial goal setting tends to fail over the medium term. Setting a goal tells the brain what you want. It does not tell the brain who you are. And the brain always prioritizes identity consistency over outcome achievement. If you want behavior to sustain itself through the inevitable periods when motivation is absent, the behavior needs to become part of how you see yourself. Not a task you perform, but a pattern that reflects your identity. That shift does not happen through affirmations or forced positivity. It happens through small, repeated actions that accumulate into a stable self-concept over time. The practical structure that emerges from all of this is built around three elements that work with the brain's actual mechanisms rather than against them. The first is environmental design. Reduce the friction between you and the behaviors you want to sustain, and increase the friction between you and the behaviors that undermine them. This is not about willpower. It is about making the path of least resistance align with your intentions. The second element is behavioral anchoring. Connect new behaviors to existing patterns in your day. The brain responds to sequences, and a new behavior attached to a reliable existing trigger is far more likely to automate than a behavior that exists in isolation without any contextual anchor. The third element is identity reinforcement through process. Focus on what the behavior makes you rather than what the behavior will eventually produce. Person-building consistency is not waiting for results to validate the effort. The consistency itself is the result, and that reframe shifts the brain's relationship with the behavior from outcome-dependent to process-oriented. None of this is about eliminating the experience of difficulty. Effort will always feel like effort. Some days the resistance will be stronger than others. That is neurologically normal. But there is a meaningful difference between a person who needs motivation to act and a person who acts regardless of motivation because the behavior has become structurally embedded in their environment and identity. The first person is at the mercy of their brain's novelty-seeking and comfort-seeking systems. The second person has built a system that reduces the influence of those systems. Motivation is real. It is genuinely useful for initiating behavior. The initial surge of excitement around a new goal can provide enough momentum to begin. But beginning is not the problem most people actually struggle with. Sustaining is the problem. And sustaining requires a completely different operating system than the one that got things started. The brain was never designed to sustain behavior through emotional inspiration. It was designed to automate what it repeatedly does in consistent contexts. Working with that design rather than continually trying to generate the emotional energy that disappears by nature is the difference between chasing motivation and actually building something that lasts. The fact that your motivation faded was never a sign that something went wrong. It was a sign that the initial phase of the process had ended. What comes next is not about feeling it again. It is about building something that no longer depends on feeling it at all.